I lived in Hollywood, Los Feliz, and Vermont. I moved to Glendale the following year. I was working full-time as an English editor of a daily newspaper called the Relocation, still being published here in Los Angeles after 90 years. But I had received a degree from UCLA in political science and had gone to work in my senior year for the Relocation. I always thought that every new job that I had, I improved my condition. While in school, I worked 12 hours on Saturdays at the Hollymont Market for $3 a Saturday. And the job at the Relocation paid me, I think, $65 a month, plus 3 meals in the commissary, of the newspaper. And as I look back, it never occurred to me that it was, hard times. It was enough to eat. We had a roof over our head, paid our rent, and I took the streetcar down to the job every day, and I enjoyed it. I saw people on street corners selling apples. I read about it in the newspaper that we were in a deep depression, that there was unemployment. I think about that time they talked about a bonus march to Washington, D.C., and you couldn't work for a daily newspaper reporting what was happening in the city, even though this was an ethnic newspaper, without being aware of the fact that there was a worldwide depression. Times were hard. The government in Washington, D.C. had started out by declaring a bank holiday, and we knew that times were hard. I think while the wage scale was such, I think I remember at that time we quoted the fact that if you were a manager of a Safeway store and earned enough to support a family of 4, 2 children, a couple, and if you got $125 a month, that was going scale. The dollar was worth a great deal more in those days, and so you didn't get as many of them. But we were in a depression. And what little economics I had studied at UCLA, I had learned that in the early days in the 19th century, we didn't call it a depression, we called it a panic. And then in the 1930s, newspapers picked up the term depression, and that's what we were suffering. It wasn't a joke, it was kind of ironic, but the most successful entrepreneur among the Japanese Americans, I think one of the more successful in the Los Angeles area, was a man named Susumu Hasuike, H-A-S-U-I-K-E, Japan-born, but he had the drive to not only own one fruit and vegetables store, but he had a chain of them. I don't remember how many he had at its peak, but it ran into several dozen. And it was said that if you got an engineering degree at UC Berkeley, they weren't handing out those degrees at UCLA, you could get a job polishing apples and stacking potatoes for 3-star produce, that it wasn't unusual to go to a fruit stand and discover that degree. In my own case, I was offered a scholarship to the University of Missouri in journalism, but it was just for the tuition. It didn't cover the cost of living. So I chose to go where I could, work and earn a salary. I think the jobs were relatively limited for people of Japanese descent in those days, as they were for other ethnic groups who belonged to so-called minorities. I think that California had a long history of anti-Oriental political agitation. The organized labor, first because when the Chinese were brought in to build the railroads, I think successive waves of Asian immigrants all ran into the same thing that Southern Europeans ran into in New York and on the East Coast. I think during my student days at UCLA, if you lived in California in the 1920s, so I've lived here since 1916, but you knew that you were not really a first-class citizen on an equal footing with other, classmates. One, it wasn't just the economic difference. I think it was more a question of knowing that customs that were, cast in concrete here. I remember the first time I walked down here into Westwood Village to get a haircut. I was a sophomore at that time, and I was told that your hair is different, so go to Little Tokyo. That was not an uncommon experience. See. If you went into good restaurants, couldn't afford them anyway, but you usually might be seated in the back. Now, this might not have been that common an experience, but I think it was in that for most people who were visibly different. If you were black, we didn't say black in those days, you were a Negro or there's other thing, or Japanese or Chinese. There weren't many other Asians, but I think the Japanese and Chinese bore the brunt of the early anti-Oriental, feeling just generally. I think most noticeably, and I ran into this on graduation from UCLA and attempting to buy a home. And you discover that within the legal framework of how you buy a home, there was a thing called, I think it was a deed which said occupancy of this property can be only by a person of Caucasian descent, which eliminated a lot of us. So I think in those ways, later as I became an English editor of the Rapashimpo and discovered that literally in Little Tokyo, I had never lived in a segregated racial community until I began to work for the newspaper. My parents had always lived in, we had the worst house in a Caucasian neighborhood, you see. Or my exposure was to customers of my parents' fruit stand, and in the course of the day, if I talked to 100 people or waited on them, and often I did more than that, there probably be not a single Japanese person. But the discovery that in a way we were hemmed in a ghetto because there's so many laws and rules that said you cannot do this and you cannot be licensed as a lawyer or as a doctor or as an accountant or in the professions because there were restrictions based upon your race, and that was pretty much typical. I think it was accepted by the first generation Japanese, but not so by the second. My parents never did feel at home. I think my mother did. She accommodated whatever had happened, and she was, I don't think she was baptized, but she accepted Christianity and sent her children to Christian Sunday school. My father, who took refuge as a Confucian scholar and his background was Buddhism, simply said that this was a white man's country. There's no place for me. If he had ever been successful in business or otherwise, he probably would have taken us all back to Japan. But he was not a businessman, and so he could never afford to. So he's really put up with it. I had very dear and good friends at school. One friend I lost this past year. We have known each other since we were in the 3rd grade at Los Feliz Elementary School. That's a long time. And I would say most of my friends, all of my friends in the school days were not Japanese. I feel very much at home. It's very much part of it. And I think in 1923, when Japan had that very severe earthquake. And my father had brought me up to believe that you could never get a square deal in dealing with anybody who was not Japanese. But I remember taking a shopping bag and walking all over Hollywood, collecting donations from people to help people who were made destitute by that earthquake, and brought back a lot of money, bag full of coins and bills. And I began to question my father. He began to feel that much of what he was saying applied to him, but not necessarily to his children. I think it was kind of funny. When I read a great deal, I went to the library constantly, and I remember one year we were to, the idea of putting a bookmark with your name on it. And I think my father's influence showed, because I looked at some of those early bookmarks and I had carved a Japanese sword and then my name, and I put that in a book. As I look back on it in later years, that was kind of funny, but it certainly indicated that my father came from what they call a samurai family in Japan. He was very proud of that. And I know one of the greatest disappointments that he expressed to my wife was that when he was getting older, he asked me would I like his collection of swords or his books. He left me his books, and he left my wife his swords. I wish I had learned to read Japanese. I never did. I was typical, I think, of those who, when I was born, I believe my father, I was born at home in Portland, Oregon, and my father, a year or two later, I think, registered me as a Japanese subject. They did that in Japan. So I was, by virtue of having been born in the United States, I was an American citizen. And at the outbreak of, or before the outbreak of war, we were made conscious of the fact that if you had dual citizenship, you were subject to the laws. If I were in Japan, I'd have to serve in the Japanese army. In this country, I'd be eligible for the draft. And that was my situation when, just before Pearl Harbor, when my wife and I married, I renounced Japanese citizenship. Part of it was due because my boss, the publisher of the Ralph Shimpo, had believed strongly himself that if we were going to live here, we should be citizens of the United States. Now, he couldn't become one because the laws forbid that. But there was that dual loyalty, fear, in much of the public in California. And I think that may account for the behavior of Japanese Americans during World War II. They were out to prove that they belonged here. So I was home in Glendale, and it was Sunday, and I had this call from my friend who was on the staff of the Los Angeles Examiner, Magner White, and he called and said, the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. And so my immediate reaction was, well, I'll have to go down to the newspaper and put out an extra, which I did. And I think I can't, my mind is fuzzy, and I thought during that hectic day, we worked on putting out, the calls were coming in everywhere, from everywhere. The English section staff was very small at the time. Louise Suski, who had been editor for many years, she was the first editor, was the person with whom I worked. They had another bilingual editor named George Nakamoto who thought he had greater opportunities in Japan, and he left, so I took his place. And the first responsibility that Mr. Komai, the publisher, gave me was, he said, you work with the Japanese section editor who does the front page. See? And I said, well, I don't, read or speak Japanese very well, is where you understand enough so that every morning my job was to take the either Rengo or Dentsu shortwave wireless dispatches that came in from Tokyo every morning, and there it was in English, Japanese written in English, called Romaji. And Mr. Shimozuma would read that to me, and it wouldn't be like Greek or Latin. And then he would explain to me what it meant, and I would be taking notes, and I would each morning write in English the article that appeared in the paper. I did 6 years of that and got to be fairly good, and I became conversant with the sound of Japanese words. You know, I was reporting about the Japanese invasion in China, the occupation of Manchuria, the military, influence in the Japanese government, and reporting that. At the same time, reporting on the impact of that in the United States, the sinking of the gunboat Panay on the Yangtze River. There are many incidents that made me aware that the thing that was happening was growing hostility, the clash of interests between the United States and Japan. And that made me realize that one day, and I'd taken, in my major in political science, I think if you go back to the 1930s, one of the lecturers there was a Professor Charles Titus, who had been in military or army intelligence, and he lectured on what he called the Columbian picture, a theory developed by professors at Columbia University on why eventually Japan and the United States would fight a war on the Pacific. And I think I also mentioned my reading of a book that I've read many times over by Homer Lee, The Valor of Ignorance, pointed out how these two forces would meet and fight a war in the Pacific. He also predicted that Japan would lose. He didn't go further on to say what they would do in the economic sphere following the war. But that was something that I lived with every day, being with the Japanese language newspaper. And incidentally, the Rapshinpo still is being published as the largest Japanese language newspaper in the United States. As I look back on it, I was writing propaganda, apologizing for what Japan was doing. And that was, considered the role that if you were a Japanese American with a sensitivity about the need for what you're doing for your own people, in quotes, then you were defensive about, and you wanted to explain all the good things that were coming out of what Japan was doing in East Asia. We were being attacked in the mainstream media, the Hearst newspapers, with people who were, writing about the yellow peril, the threat to the safety of the Republic, with the people who were multiplying like rabbits on the West Coast, the Japanese. We were not Japanese Americans, we just simply were Japanese. And I think the tone of the Los Angeles Times, which today is regarded as middle of the road or even left of center on many issues, felt that there really may or may not have been a place for the descendants of the Japanese immigrants. I think they felt the same way about the Chinese. You had the native sons and daughters of the Golden West, the American Legion, the Grange. These were organizations of groups of people who really owned and ran cities and communities and areas up and down California. And I think their ability to, influence the legislature to pass laws that restricted the opportunities for people who were not of Caucasian descent That was the order of the day. The thing that we feared probably was that we would either be incarcerated, put into camps, or deported. We had in the Congress of the United States senators from, say, Mississippi. I think there was a man named Stewart. There was another one named Rankin. Stewart was from Tennessee. But people who I used to, subscribe to and read the Congressional Record. I think Senator Stewart quoted a very popular sports writer whom I read faithfully, except when he wrote about he was named Henry McLemore. And he says, by God, when a war comes, the only thing we can do is to round them all up, put them on an island in the Pacific, and sink the island. I mean, this was not an uncommon point of view. This made, people who are living in these, if they weren't physical ghettos, they were mental ghettos, people who felt that the walls around them were so high, it was hard to get over them. And that most of us, had been born and raised on the West Coast. We didn't know what the rest of the country was like. And as a consequence, I think there was a great deal of anxiety that, my God, what's going to happen if and when the war comes? And this may account as I look back in retrospect, the only vocal organization representing this beleaguered group was called the Japanese American Citizen League. And, much of what this group and its leaders did at that time maybe was an overreaction to this fear that, my God, we don't have too many defenses and we haven't got too great a chance. I think this is what happened. In October of 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, I had been for some time talking with my publisher. I think in 1939 and 40, created some real problems for the business office by, in my, eagerness to fight against discriminatory practices. I had picked up a quotation from a San Francisco publication called the Newsletter and Wasp. And I quoted them because at that time there was a drive on to deprive Japanese fishermen in this Terminal Island area of their right to run to earn a livelihood. They were going to pass laws that would restrict them. And I picked up a quotation from the Newsletter and Wasp in San Francisco and ran it without permission. And we got sued by that paper, $1,500. Now, for someone earning $65 a month, that's a fortune, and I thought he was going to fire me. Instead, he sent me to a lawyer that represented the newspaper, a man named Marcus Roberts, and said, he's going to lecture to you on what you should do. That out of ignorance, you've done these things. It's going to cost the publisher, more than a year's salary for you. He didn't fire me. He told me to go and study law, you see. I didn't know where I could find the time. I was holding another job beside the newspaper because I wanted to earn some more money. But I went down to the University of Southern California Library and began reading things. Eventually, I took a correspondence course from LaSalle Extension University. When I had reported to Mr. Comey that during World War I, German language newspapers owned by, in quotes, enemy aliens were allowed to publish under what was called the Espionage Act of 1917, and expressed to him the opinion that perhaps that might apply to us if and when war came. He arranged with the Central Japanese Association, which was an organization of first-generation Japanese, to have its president, a man named Nakamura, go to Washington, and I would go with him, and Mr. Nakamura would take care of Central Japanese Association business, and I would see Mr. Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, and ask him if he could then grant to the Rapushimpo the permission to publish. And I did. I flew in, it was about 2 months before Pearl Harbor, to Washington, D.C. First time I really had been out of Los Angeles County, I think, since I had moved here as an infant. And I saw Mr. Biddle, and I also then took that occasion to interview and visit about 80 members of the Senate and Congress, the House of Representatives, beginning with the California delegation, and wrote articles for the RAFU about it. And in that experience, I discovered that, I was ordered by the War Department to appear the day after my visit with Mr. Biddle to go to the munitions building of the War Department. And I was interviewed and interrogated for a good part of the day by a man named Colonel Sumter Bratton, head of G2, which was intelligence of the Army, and his assistant, Major Wallace Moore. And at that time, I discovered for the first time, to my surprise, that the Army had a complete set of the Rafushimpo, all the editorials that I had ever written in the 6 years that I was an English editor. And they also had things in the Japanese section. And I was questioned as to whether or not I had written for both sections because they were in contradiction to one another. One waved the American flag, they said, the other waved the Japanese flag. And that they were, they made it quite plain that it looked rather suspicious. It was, for me, a learning experience, of course. How do you say that, for the greater glory of the Emperor of Japan and the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, that the Japanese are like big brothers to the Chinese? They're going to teach them, not only manners, but to be civilized. It shook me up. Wonder what in the world. And then at that point I realized how inadequate I had been because I didn't understand Japanese. I didn't read it and I didn't write it. And I was certain in my own mind they don't believe a word that I said when I said I don't know what's going on there. That Pearl Harbor, after I had been notified by a friend at the Los Angeles Examiner that the Japanese were and had bombed Pearl Harbor, I drove down to the newspaper. By then I had come into an automobile and didn't have to take a train or a streetcar. And I spent the day there. On that day we were answering inquiries, and I jotted down that a man named Damon Runyon came in to interview me about what he wanted to know how I felt and what was. When I said, "What do you think's going to happen to us?" He said, "Well, who knows?" But he wrote a column about Little Tokyo on that day, and I remember being approached by two gentlemen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation who said they had a presidential warrant for my arrest and I must come along with them. So I didn't have time to say, we had 5 or 6 staff people too there. As well, I want to call my lawyer. No time for that. I thought I'd call Marcus Roberts, and I couldn't call him. Just come along. So I was taken to the central jail and booked. And they fingerprinted me, took my picture, took all of my things, and I was put into a cell with, there was a young Mexican who said, "What are you in here for?" And he said he had been taking and selling drugs. But he carved a little crucifix out of a toothbrush handle and gave it to me. I carried that for years. He said he was a German, but I think he was or a Russian. And I said, "Why are you in here?" And he says, "Well, there's this Jewish restaurant I've been going to for years, and every time I go in, I've been saying Heil Hitler." These are my cellmates for my first night in. They moved me on the 3rd or 4th day to Lincoln Heights. All of my friends, Japanese Americans, they're all first-generation Japanese. I knew them all. They moved us around, and I was taken to Lincoln Heights, and then from there moved to county jail on top of the Hall of Justice. I was in for 11 days and nights. My wife thought I was dead. Or, there was a doctor from Gardena, I think his name was Honda, and he committed suicide in there. He had been accused of being the head of the Japanese Veterans Association. He died in there, but they just released me. I think one reason I have a fetish about keeping, a diary all these years is that the FBI got a hold of my diary then, and of course I went everywhere as as a reporter and an editor. Mm-hmm. I know when I was interrogated on my way by the two agents, they said, well, what are you, arresting me for? And he said, well, you've been there to see Attorney General Biddle, you've been in the White House to see Mrs. Roosevelt, all these congressmen, and your movements are so suspicious, and I said, well, I'm a newspaper man, but they told me that's the reason for, I'm held on suspicion. Years later, under the Freedom of Information Act, I was a member of the Black Dragon Society, I was a member of the Communist Party, and furthermore, they didn't believe that my name was my own, see, because Togo was the name of a Japanese admiral who had sunk the Russian fleet in a battle. Well, I was worried about my wife, and she was pregnant. She was 9 months pregnant. But you make the best of it, and I prayed a great deal. I think people tended to accommodate, they simply made the best of what they could. I think it was a bitterness. We were mad. I must have found an outlet for it by writing to people that I had known. There was one gentleman who later he ran for governor of California, Robert Walker Kenney. He became Attorney General when Earl Warren was governor. And I had met Bob Kenney when he was a reporter, later became a Superior Court judge, and he was a great teacher about, politics. And I corresponded with him, and I said, I don't understand. I'm now an enemy alien, 3C. Yeah, that's what it was. In 1944, when I was now out and a volunteer worker for the American Friends Service Committee, helping to bring people out of, Auschwitz and Belsen and the European death camps and finding jobs for them in Chicago, he wrote me and said, I'm coming to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention, and he was a Henry Wallace delegate. He invited me to the Palmer House, and we had lunch. And he said, I finally found out that you're never, you still think you're going to be taken into either naval intelligence or into the Army. He says, forget it, see, that you'll never make it. And I said, why? And he said, well, simple. You've got people on your draft board who say that you are a figment, that you've been planted in this country, and that's why, I said, well, I don't even read or write Japanese. Well, that's why you fit the need for, them to find someone who. I learned secondhand about the overall problem in California from a man named Kerry McWilliams, who was a wonderful teacher. He had become, I think, under Governor Olson, a Democratic governor, head chief of housing and immigration. Immigration referring to, Oklahoma migrants who were coming here. And I shared with him the feeling that the arrogance of the established people who were well off in California in trying to exclude these people was no different from the racial bigotry that victimized people who were not, within the majority group. And so not only was I empathetic or sympathetic to their plight, but wondered what in the world people could do in any way to help. And later on, in my Chicago years, I had the chance to become an editor of the American School News, which was a correspondence publication. And I've met many, many people from Oklahoma in that. And I found that, I had always felt deprived because of my race, and yet I had the ability now to help, thousands. Actually, there were several 100,000 of these students around the world, but in the United States, who were deprived of a decent education. And so I felt that it was an interesting topsy-turvy kind of world where you had an opportunity to use what you had to help others. And I think the plight of the Okies the chief of police of Los Angeles had patrols at the border to turn these people back in every way. And so, when I mentioned the John Steinbeck's book and the movie that was made of it, I think that helped to enlighten people about the 30s and what the economic plight. And in a way, there are examples of that today because we have the same kind of problems on a bigger scale. That was my first World's Fair in Treasure Island, San Francisco, and I was impressed by the foreign exhibits, but it was nothing like subsequent fairs that I have been to. But I think it was California's effort to begin to dig itself out of the economic depression. And that kind of attempt, you see it even today, you hope that it succeeds. I think my first reaction was one of disbelief, that it was a flagrant, demonstration of what the Japanese military were intending to do. I think they were flaunting and looking for, some reason. But I went dutifully to try to give the Japanese version of why it happened, the meddling by the United States, that if you get into a war zone, you might get shot or you might get sunk. And I think it was the cries for boycott of Japanese goods and the anti-Japanese feelings that engendered, just generally in California, in Southern California, I think spread a feeling of uneasiness among people who were Japanese American readers of our newspaper. I think we've, with all of the things that people say may be wrong with us, my wife and I have visited, by last count, 43 countries around the world, but since then we've been all over the world. We've met people, we visit with them in their homes, we love to travel. With all the things that are wrong, I think that we talk about the goals in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and there's nothing static about them, and the fact that we have not been able to, fulfill those goals, each time we come home to, this is home. Whatever is wrong with it, we prefer to be here to any other place in the world. And we have, I think, a lot of friends who feel exactly that way. I served on the board for a few years of an organization here called the Constitutional Rights Foundation, and we observed the bicentennial of it, I think, last year. I no longer am on that board. And for about 45 years, I've been a recipient of the Lincoln Foundation's publication. And a few years ago, after we had been enraged for all these years about what had happened to us and the violation of our civil rights, I learned that the great emancipators suspended the Bill of Rights in order that the Union could survive. If it's a question of survival, what choice do we have? The fact that we happen to be on the wrong end of the thing made us, victims. But had we been sitting where the people who had to make those hard decisions were, we might have done the same thing. But ultimately, I think justice does prevail. When I had the privilege of working for and with the American Friends Service Committee in Chicago for, I guess it was 1943, 4, up to 5, so about 2.5 years. Every morning, see, I couldn't be a Quaker because I didn't feel I was good enough to adopt their principles. But every morning, we'd hold hands in a circle, the whole staff would be, and they would pray in their fashion, whatever came to mind, you see. And they defined it as, not living by the teachings of Jesus, that, the lack of concern for those less fortunate, which typifies the attitude of so many people when they talked about the homeless, the poor, and the Okies. And then I remembered we were rescued in the very depths of the worst experience we had, when we didn't know whether we were going to have to go back where they wanted to kill us, or were they going to deport us to Japan. The Quakers came along and made it possible for us to get over that and come to Chicago. And they were the first people who were welcomed on both sides of a battle zone. So we look back, and members of various Christian church groups did a great deal to salvage and to save, us. Why shouldn't we do the same for others? And I think this is one of the lessons that we learned out of our evacuation experience. You don't give up, and that whatever the obstacles may be, you do not lose faith. And, I choose to try to take the positive reaction to whatever may happen. But, you're going to go eventually, but you want to delay it as long as possible. But if you've been close to it, you get a sense of values that, and I think it begins with family. We just celebrated our 52nd anniversary in Honolulu.